my daughter's better option.
April came to stay with us in North Carolina when she was 15 years old. There were arguments with her mom. They didn't get along with each other well. As most teenagers do, she entered into a bit of a rebellious stage. Just mischievous stuff, going out at night, sneaking out. Typical teen stuff. I knew that April had a dim future if she kept doing things the way she'd been doing them. My wife and I had discussed some boundaries for her. She would be going to church, that she wouldn't be dating anybody unless we talked to them. We knew when April arrived, she was not equipped to lead her own life in a positive way. And so when she came to us, we tried to give her a fresh start. I first heard the name Jerry when she had asked me if we could meet a boy she was interested in dating. Jerry had come over to cook us dinner one night. I had asked him about his work, how he had got into cooking, whether he liked his job as cooking, what maybe some of his future plans were. It was obvious that he cared for her, but there was an arrogance and pride in the way Jerry carried himself. It wasn't long after they started dating that I started having some red flags go up. I really don't remember April coming to us about struggles that she had with Jerry until they had moved in together. Sometimes she would talk about the arguing and the fighting, and the fighting even got physical at one time, and they were supposed to go to anger management classes. We knew that there was trouble in paradise. The longer she was in relationship with him, the more fearful my wife and I became. April had decided, and with Jerry's consent, I guess, that they were going to get married, that they were going to keep this baby, that they were going to make a go of it. We got a call from her mother one day saying that she hadn't heard anything from her daughter for, I think it was either a week or 2 weeks. And that was odd because April was keeping good contact with her mother, sharing the stuff about the development of the baby, the fact that the baby was a girl. And she asked us to please go to visit their apartment and find out what was going on.
I was 7 months pregnant with Caleb when we got married. I was 19 and he was 21. Before the maternity leave was over was the first time we separated. During my second pregnancy, I found a letter, and it was so soaked in perfume that the paper was oily, almost transparent. And it was a letter to Jerry saying that, "I'm so happy that you came to see me. I know you feel obligated to stay right now because she's pregnant again." And it just went on. And it was clear that this was a relationship that was existing outside of our marriage. I walked in, Jerry was on the phone, hung up real quick. "I gotta go," click. And he said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I lived here till today." The next thing I knew, he was throwing stuff at me. my great-grandmother's wedding dishes. And he broke every one of them. And when that was done, he started throwing knives at me. I just was terrified. I never saw a violent side to Jerry Stewart until the day in that kitchen. You know, a lot of people started kind of shutting Jerry out because of not wanting to deal with April. The stories that he would tell of that relationship, even what few details he shared with me, they were always violent, tumultuous. You know, she couldn't come to his mom's house. That was not allowed. I stayed pretty involved with his family even after the separation. It was important to me that Caleb and Chrissy knew both sides of their family. I still regularly took the kids to see their grandparents. I saw him one day at his sister's house with the kids, and he was telling me what had happened that morning. April stabbed him in the neck with a pair of scissors. And I looked at him and I said, Jerry, you have got to get out of this relationship. It's obviously not good. And the way things are going, if you don't get out of this relationship, you're gonna wind up dead or in jail.
A trash can had washed up off of Stone Street Extension in Hall River, North Carolina, on some farmland. When I hear the call on the radio, I could tell by the officer's voice that this was not good. I immediately proceeded over there, and I was thinking, you know, knowing this particular officer, this has got to be bad, you know, just listening to his voice. The Back Creek had just receded because it had been raining, and the barrel was still pretty much closed, except that it broke loose with tape that was taping the barrel shut. And it had come loose a little bit. And we were told that it was a human body. The body had deteriorated, and that means that that person had to have been killed some time ago. In Alamance County, it's a lot like Mayberry. You know, just everybody just about knows everybody. It's a slow pace of living. Very seldom do we have something like this happen there. I seen that the individual's body had deteriorated some. I knew that it wasn't one that recently that hadn't been reported or a kidnapping occurred. I knew it had to be somebody that's been missing for a month or two. But at that time, I did not know who.
One of my son's only memories of April Renee was when she saw us at a restaurant, and she came over to say hi, and Jesse was just a little tyke, and she picked Jesse up in her arms and started loving on him, and that's what Jesse said. He says, the only thing I remember about April Renee is how much she loved me. I guess it's a good memory. We received a call from April's mom that she hadn't heard from her in several weeks. You know, my natural thought was, well, she's taken the car and gone somewhere. Maybe she's run off with another man. Maybe, you know, the possibilities were endless. got there and her car was there, that really bothered me. Jerry wasn't home. And when we looked in the back seat of the car, the baby bag that mothers who are advanced in their pregnancy carry with them was in the back of the car. And then I opened the trunk. The coat that we had given her was in the back of the car, and that was like her favorite winter coat. After the lady that lived downstairs came out and spoke with us briefly, I said, we need to look in that storage space. I opened the storage room door, and in the storage room was April's belongings. Right as soon as I opened the door was her purse. I opened up her purse and looked in her wallet, and the only thing missing was her driver's license. Her military ID card, her insurance cards, everything was intact, just the driver's license gone. Something was just not right. So I knew at that time we had to go to the police.
She and I had gotten in an argument, and it got physical, and the police showed up. I figured she'd go away and come back in a couple of days. When she didn't, the police started looking for her.
My first introduction to April, I stopped at their apartment. April came to the door, and I said, I need to see Jerry. Chrissy looks at April and she says, I want my daddy. And April looks at my child and says, he's not your daddy anymore. He's gonna marry me and you'll never see him again. I didn't care for April at all after she told Chrissy that her father wasn't her father anymore. But then I look back and I think to myself, well, I don't know what he was telling her, you know? Like, I wasn't there for those conversations. I don't hate April. I never really did. I hated the picture that Jerry painted of April. I didn't really know April as a person. I pulled into the driveway from work, and my son comes running outside, and he says, Mommy, 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 my daddy was on the Fox 8 5 o'clock news. And I said, oh, did Daddy open another restaurant? And he said, no, Mommy, not this time. His girlfriend's missing.
Police are searching for a missing 20-year-old woman, April Renee Greer of Alamance County.
Nobody's seen her since Valentine's Day. Nobody's heard anything from her. "25 minutes later, I'm pulling into the driveway, and I stopped halfway into the driveway because April's car was pulled over in the driveway. And I thought to myself, well, if she's missing, why is her car here? Who takes off for good and doesn't take their car? So, you know, the hairs on the back of my neck kind of stood up. When I walked in the door, I said, okay, so what's going on? And all he would say was, she left me. That answer didn't satisfy me because now you can't explain to me why her car's sitting in the driveway. As I was leaving that night, he said, "Em, promise me that no matter what happens, no matter what you hear, my kids will always know how much I love them. Don't ever let them doubt that I love them." I knew there was something he wasn't telling me, and I just felt sick to my stomach.
When we find a body that we cannot identify, we go in to pull every possible missing person report within the state. And then from there, try to do investigation to narrow it down to one or two individuals that it possibly could be. It took, in my opinion, and what I gather, it took an individual that was very irate over something that had a lot of hate and possibly previous problems with an individual. You know, to just kill an individual, that happens every day around the country. But when you kill an individual and then you take and cut their legs off at the hip and stuff, I'm not sure all this brutality wasn't just to be able to get her in that trash can, if you understand what I'm saying. I think there was a lot of hate or real violent feelings at the time this homicide occurred. April Greer was reported missing to the Burlington Police Department. I think we found out she was last seen on February 13th and had not been seen since. Burlington police had searched his apartment when she was missing initially. Sherry told Burlington she had left him, that they weren't together anymore. He don't know where she went. At that point in time, I don't think they had anything to suspect that she didn't leave. When you have a missing person from February to April, as an officer, you know something is not right. You know, matter of fact, if a person is reported missing, I get very concerned after a week if we've not been able to find something regarding that person. Talking with Jerry Lynn Stewart initially, he basically stayed with what the statement he gave the FBI initially. And I'll be honest with you, I could tell he was lying.
Nobody wants to think that their pregnant niece was murdered. We were hopeful. We were praying a lot. We were saying, you know, Lord, where is she? What's going on? What's going on? God hears everything, but I think it's easier for him to respond when you cry out with everything that's in you. And after I'd been praying that for a while with my wife, it started raining real hard. And it rained some more. And that's when they found her body. The trash can had been sealed with duct tape, and they had buried it in a shallow sandbar. And when the rain came and that dirt became soft, it bubbled up out of the ground and washed up on a farmer's field. And the farmer saw buzzards circling, and that's how they found her. They identified April's body by the steel plates she had had put in her ankle after she broke her ankle, and also the class ring that she was wearing. The one thing that eased the pain a little bit was how fast the arrest and the charges came. It was within 24 hours after they found the body that they had arrested Jerry Stewart for the murder.
Burlington police had searched his apartment when she was missing, but did not turn the mattress over. Bottom of the mattress was covered in blood. Once I saw that, I knew who the person was in my mind. I backed out. Our crime scene people did the rest of the crime scene. The axe and knife found up in the attic. Bloody clothes. When we found out the green trash can had been seen being loaded into April Greer's car by Jerry Lynn Stewart Jr., we felt we were pretty much on tab with who it was. This is a statement that I took on Tuesday, April 22nd, 2003. I took this statement from Jerry Lynn Stewart Jr. It is exactly word for word what he said. Our door was barely standing open. I walked in. I walked into the living room. I saw candles lit everywhere. I walked into the kitchen. I saw blood and one of April's legs cut off, laying in the floor. Off black trash bags with yellow ties were laying in the floor. Blood looked like dried ketchup was everywhere. It really smelled. I then went into her bedroom and saw more candles lit, and April was laying on the bed. Her thumbs were tied by a rope to the underneath of the mattress. Her other leg was beside of the rest of her body. Her foot was up next to her head. Her throat was cut. I changed clothes because I was covered in blood. You know, if I'd have went in and my girlfriend had her legs chopped up and murdered, I'd have been screaming bloody murder. I'd have called the police, whatever. He didn't do any of that. He cleaned it up, or tried to.
I was at work. I answered the phone and I said, "Hi, this is Emily." And my sister-in-law said, "Hey, it's me. They found a body in Back Creek." And without hesitation, the words out of my mouth were, "Oh my God, it's April." That evening, I basically planted myself in front of the TV.
This evening, police have detained Jerry Stewart in connection with the...
And so I'm just glued to anything that the news says. And I was just like, I just don't think I could wrap my head around all of it. Like, I just kind of rejected that idea. The next morning, I woke up and I walked out of my bedroom door, and the first thing I saw was Jerry's mugshot on the television screen. I'm sure that April's baby was the very last thing on her mind. And he could have saved her. Well, I guess he could have not done any of it. And I struggle with that one because my kids really struggle with that piece. And that's the part that they can't forgive their father for. They can't forgive him for murdering their sister. And how can I blame him? I went to Jerry's trial every day except one. The defense lawyers argued it was a fight that went too far, and at some point, Jerry snapped. Looking back, the hardest part to sit through was the medical examiner's testimony. And they said that if he had just stopped what he was doing, if he had come to his senses and called 911 and gotten help, he had 8 minutes from the time that April was dead to save that baby. And I think about that, like, I'm sure that her baby was her last thought. The evidence was overwhelming. I was never in a fairy tale bubble about that. But I didn't want Jerry sentenced to death. He had 2 very small children that I had no idea how to explain the death penalty to. How do I go home to my 2 kids tonight and tell them that their daddy has to die?
I had heard that he had concocted her favorite dessert that night. It was how evil can get.
I'm about to read the report from the psychiatrist that dealt with Jerry Lynn Stewart prior to his trial. He said, the more she talked, the worse it got. I could feel my heart beating inside my head. There was a knife on the dresser. I used the knife to cut the ropes. I turned around to cut the ropes, and the next thing I knew, my left arm was covered in blood. There was no big spew of blood, no death struggle. I was just on my knees in front of her. I was thinking, if I can just cut these ropes, I'll leave and go away. I turned around, and the next thing I knew, she was dead. So he killed her. And in this situation, it was right along what I'd said earlier, to do something like this. Someone had to be very, very angry. He got what he deserved, except, he should have got the death penalty. February 13th to April 21st when we found her body. That says something about the individual that committed this crime. In my opinion, they're not much of a human being. I'm not sure he wasn't a little sadistically off.
She showed up at Charlie's about 2 weeks ago, max. and a little green Explorer. She and I got in an argument. I figured she'd go away and come back in a couple of days. When she didn't, the police started looking for her.
He has no remorse whatsoever, and he's killed a human being and cut him up like a doggone animal. He knew what he was doing. And I have a hard time understanding how another human being could do that. Of course, I'm not a psychologist, and I know that there's a lot of reasons some people go off the deep end, but that right there, in my opinion, which is plain doggone meanness, vicious meanness. I hope every day that he sits in that cell in Central Prison, or wherever he's at now in the state prison system, that it goes on his mind what he does, and he has to live with that till the day he draws his last breath.
When they finally made their decision and they gave him life in prison, I was relieved. Like, okay, so he's in prison for the rest of his life, but that still gives him an opportunity to maintain a relationship with his children. I had taken the kids to visit Jerry in county jail religiously every weekend. We would wait 3 hours to see him for 15 minutes, and then we'd go home. And during that time, Jerry was very much like, I love my kids, I'm concerned about my kids, and my kids, my kids, my kids, my kids, my kids. And he also found Jesus. But don't they all? My daughter said, my mama keeps telling me that they're going to get him out of jail. But I don't want them to. Because what if he comes to kill me and my mommy? It broke my heart. My baby is literally scared that her own father would take her life. And I didn't know how to make her feel safe. She was 5. One day, Jerry had called and said that he no longer wanted to see the kids or me, that it was too painful to him when we left and to watch us go. So that was when we stopped going to visit.
I can still see her in the barrel when I think about it, that sitting on the ground near the back creek. And then there's still a question in my mind, how could a human being, a living human being, do this to another human being? My wife, she'll tell you, I dream this stuff when I'm working a case. She said, I've woke up many times at night talking to myself, about the cases. And that keeps me going as an officer to try to solve these cases. I chose this career, and I'm gonna live with whatever we have to do to make it successful. He didn't give a flip about that girl. He wouldn't have acted that way. That's a sorry human being. A cruel human being. I guess you say I'm glad we got the killer. That's a human being. Didn't deserve to die that way.
She had a email list of about 15 or 20 people that she would always update them on how the pregnancy was coming along, what she was doing, what their plan was, how they were going to decorate the baby room, even the name of the baby. They found out the baby was going to be a girl, and they came up with the name Heaven Lee. Middle name Lee, first name Heaven. They had a memorial service to honor her and the death of her baby. It helped me overcome the feeling that she died for nothing. I mean, it gave me a sense of her worth and her value, and that her life was eternally significant. That she was probably looking down and rejoicing. If you can do that from heaven, I don't know. I feel in my heart I've forgiven him, but the forgiveness doesn't free him, it frees me. And I didn't want to be in bondage to that man and what he did. That's got to be my favorite picture of her. She was so tickled that my wife had taken her to have some glamour photos done. And the expression is just the happiness of April. They captured her expression in that photograph. It reminds me of who she really was.
The smoke never really cleared from the pine woods of East Texas. It just hung there for 40 years, tasting like copper and old secrets. In the humid twilight of October 1985, a small town called Oak Haven didn't just lose a daughter. It buried its own conscience under a shallow bed of pine needles and damp earth. For decades, people walked past the old, rusted drainage ditch on the outskirts of Route 9, turning their heads away from the ditch where 16-year-old high school cheerleader Becky Vance was found, her throat cut with surgical precision, her white uniform stained a deep, terrible crimson. The town didn't talk about it, because when a small, God-fearing community is hit by an act of pure, unadulterated evil, the silence becomes a survival mechanism. They told themselves it was a drifter, a hitchhiker passing through from Houston, someone who belonged to the highway and not to the pews of the First Baptist Church where everyone gathered every Sunday morning to pray for Becky's soul. But the highway didn't leave a half-smoked Winston cigarette glinting in the morning, due just 3 feet from her cold, lifeless hand. The highway didn't know that Becky always took the shortcut behind the high school stadium after Friday night football practice. The killer was someone who knew the shadows of Oak Haven like the back of his own hand, someone who watched her walk under the flickering amber streetlights, waiting for the perfect, silent moment to strike. For 40 long years, that cigarette butt sat in a cardboard evidence box in the basement of the county sheriff's office, labeled as an unsolved atrocity, a cold case that withered away as the original detectives grew old, retired, and took their suspicions to their graves. But the dead have a way of speaking when the living least expect it, and a single microscopic strand of dried saliva, trapped for nearly 4 decades inside the paper filter of a discarded smoke, was about to unleash a psychological earthquake that would tear the holy facade of Oak Haven completely to pieces. The scene in 1985 was a masterclass in panic and primitive forensics, a chaotic circus of flashing red lights reflecting off the wet pine bark while a young, overwhelmed deputy tried to keep a crowd of horrified locals from trampling the wet ground. The air smelled of impending rain and cheap gasoline. When the coroner finally turned Becky's body over, the sheer violence of the attack sent a shockwave through the line of onlookers. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It was a ritual of absolute control. Her silver promise ring was still on her finger, her small canvas backpack untouched, containing nothing but 3 school textbooks, a lip gloss, and a handwritten prayer journal. The killer wanted nothing but her life, and he took it with a cold, calculated ferocity that suggested this wasn't his first time drawing blood, or certainly wouldn't be his last. Sheriff Thomas Miller, a man who had handled nothing heavier than cattle rustling and public intoxication for a decade, stood over the ditch with a heavy flashlight, its beam shaking as it illuminated the stark, pale face of a girl he had seen selling bake sale cookies just the week before. The community was instantly paralyzed by a suffocating paranoia. Locks were installed on doors that had remained open since the Great Depression, and parents kept their children indoors before the sun even hit the horizon. Rumors spread like wildfire through the local diners and beauty salons, accusing the strange mechanic at the edge of town, the lonely janitor who worked the night shift at the school, or any young man who looked a little too long at the floor during Sunday service. Yet, despite hundreds of interviews, polygraph tests that led to dead ends, and a mounting stack of tip sheets that grew thicker by the month, the investigation hit an iron wall. The technology of 1985 could only classify the blood type on the cigarette as type A, a match for nearly 40% of the male population, leaving the town to simmer in its own toxic soup of mutual distrust while the trail went ice cold. As the years bled into decades, the memory of Becky Vance became a ghost story used to frighten rebellious teenagers who wanted to stay out past curfew, a cautionary tale about the dangers of the dark Texas backroads. The Vances eventually packed up their shattered lives and moved across the state, unable to bear the sight of the empty swing set in their front yard or the heavy, judging glances of neighbors who looked at them with a mixture of pity and relief that it wasn't their own child. The First Baptist Church of Oak Haven grew larger, its congregation expanding as a charismatic, young, and deeply devoted spiritual leader named Thomas Sterling took the pulpit in the late 1980s, healing the town's broken spirit with his booming, compassionate voice and his unyielding crusade against the moral decay of the modern world. Pastor Sterling became the bedrock of the community, a man who married the young, buried the old, and sat at the bedsides of the dying, offering a comforting hand that had guided thousands of lost souls back into the light. He was the one who organized the annual candlelight vigil for Becky every October, standing before the altar with tears in his eyes, preaching about the mysterious ways of justice and how the Lord would eventually bring the wicked to account, if not in this world, then surely in the fires of the next. No one noticed how his hands trembled slightly whenever the local newspaper ran a retrospective article on the anniversary of the murder, and no one thought twice about why he always volunteered to counsel the Vance family in their darkest hours, absorbing their grief with a solemn, stoic empathy that made him a living saint in the eyes of the county. He was a man above suspicion, a pillar of absolute righteousness wrapped in a tailored suit, his life a testament to faith and community devotion, while the cardboard box in the police archive gathered dust, its contents fading into historical irrelevance. The turning point came with the quiet entry of a new generation of investigators who didn't grow up under the shadow of Pastor Sterling's sermons, young detectives armed with tools that the old-school lawmen of 1985 couldn't have envisioned in their wildest dreams. In the spring of 2026, the Texas Department of Public Safety launched a specialized cold case initiative, utilizing advanced investigative genetic genealogy to re-examine the biological evidence from the state's most frustrating, unsolved homicides. A young forensic analyst named Sarah Lynn pulled Becky's file from the dark recesses of the archive, her eyes narrowing at the mention of the single Winston cigarette that had been preserved in a sealed glass vial. The original testing had barely scratched the surface, but with modern forensic DNA profiling, a microscopic sample could be amplified into a full genomic map, a digital blueprint of a killer's identity that could be uploaded into public genealogical databases. The process was painstaking, requiring the extraction of degraded DNA molecules that had survived decades of temperature fluctuations in a humid Texas basement, but the machines didn't lie. Within weeks, the digital sequence was complete, generating a complex profile that didn't match anyone in the National Criminal Database, meaning the killer had never been fingerprinted or convicted of a felony in the 40 years since the crime. But the database did something far more terrifying. It found familial matches, distant cousins, second uncles, and great-grandparents whose modern descendants had uploaded their DNA to discover their ancestry, inadvertently drawing a digital noose around a monster who thought he had escaped the judgment of man. The genealogical web began to tighten around a specific branch of an old East Texas family tree, a lineage that led straight back into the heart of Oak Haven itself, shocking the analysts as they realized the killer was not a phantom highwayman, but a son of the local soil. Detective Lynn and her team spent weeks mapping out the family tree, eliminating relatives who were too young, too old, or living thousands of miles away at the time Becky Vance was torn from the world. The mathematical certainty of the DNA matches pointed to a single household, narrowing the suspects down to 3 brothers who grew up in the county during the mid-1980s. 2 of the brothers had passed away years ago in tragic accidents, leaving their medical records and surviving children to provide elimination DNA samples that cleared their names from the ledger of suspicion. The 3rd brother, however, was very much alive, a man whose life had taken a radically different path, a man who had built an empire of faith and moral authority on the very ground where Becky's blood had soaked into the earth. When the name Thomas Sterling appeared at the terminal end of the genealogical algorithm, the investigative team sat in absolute, stunned silence. They weren't looking at a career criminal or a broken-down drifter. They were looking at the spiritual shepherd of the very community that had been mourning the victim for 40 years. The psychological shockwaves of this discovery threatened to shatter the entire county, forcing the detectives to move with absolute, airtight precision, knowing that a single misstep would cause a catastrophic public backlash against the police department for targeting a beloved holy man. The operation to secure a direct, matching DNA sample from Pastor Sterling had to be conducted with the stealth of a Black Ops mission, as they couldn't simply walk up to his grand estate with a search warrant based on a genealogical probability without tipping him off and risking his flight. For 3 weeks, plainclothes detectives shadowed the pastor as he went about his holy duties, watching him preach to packed pews on Sundays, lead Bible study groups on Tuesdays, and visit the elderly at the local hospice on Thursday afternoons. They watched a man who exuded an aura of serene peace, yet their eyes were fixed on his mouth, waiting for him to discard something, anything, that carried his current genetic imprint. The moment came at a small diner on the edge of the county line, a place where Sterling went to eat alone after a long funeral service, thinking he was far away from the eyes of his devoted flock. He sat in a corner booth, staring out the window at the gray Texas drizzle, his face devoid of the warm, pastoral smile he usually wore like a shield, replaced instead by a cold, vacant stare that chilled the watching undercover officer to the bone. He pulled a pack of cigarettes from his coat pocket, a habit he kept strictly hidden from his congregation, who believed he lived a life of pristine purity, and lit a single cigarette, inhaling deeply, as if trying to smoke away the ghosts of his past. When he finished, he crushed the butt into a cheap porcelain ashtray, left a $5 bill on the table, and walked out into the rain, completely unaware that before the door had even finished swinging shut, an investigator had secured the filter with a pair of sterile tweezers. The laboratory results came back in less than 48 hours, an undeniable 1 in a billion match between the saliva on the diner cigarette and the 40-year-old DNA preserved from the crime scene of 1985. The monster who had severed the life of Becky Vance wasn't a nameless phantom of the dark. He was the man who had stood at her memorial services, the man who had looked her grieving mother in the eye and promised that God had a plan for her pain. The arrest warrant was signed by a local judge whose hands shook so violently the ink smeared across the parchment, his mind unable to comprehend that the man who had baptized his own children was a cold-blooded killer. The takedown was scheduled for a bright Tuesday morning, right outside the church offices, to minimize the chance of a violent standoff in a residential area or a hostage situation inside the sanctuary he called his home. As the black, unmarked SUVs swerved into the gravel parking lot of the First Baptist Church, pinning the pastor's luxury sedan in its stall, the air in Oak Haven seemed to freeze, the birds in the old oaks stopping their songs as the reality of the nightmare began to unfold. Sterling was walking down the stone steps of the church, holding a leather-bound Bible in his right hand, when the heavily armed tactical officers emerged with their weapons drawn, shouting commands that broke the morning peace like a thunderclap. He didn't run, he didn't scream, and he didn't fight. He simply stopped, closed his eyes for a long, agonizing second, and let the Bible slip from his fingers, watching it fall into the dust as the steel handcuffs clicked locked around his wrists. The news broke across the state like a tectonic rupture, sending television crews and investigative journalists speeding toward Oak Haven from every corner of the country, their satellite dishes crowding the small town square that had once been so quiet. The headline, Texas 1985 Cold Case Solved, DNA on cigarette leads to local pastor's arrest, flashed across national screens, leaving millions of viewers in a state of absolute, breathless disbelief as the details of the betrayal began to leak from the courthouse. Members of his congregation gathered outside the police station in a state of collective psychosis, some weeping openly on their knees, praying for what they believed was a horrific mistake or a malicious frame job by secular forces trying to destroy their church. Others stood in stunned, catatonic silence, staring at the mugshot of their beloved pastor, a picture that stripped away the soft lighting of the pulpit to reveal a hollow, tired, and deeply sinister visage beneath the silver hair. The realization that the man who had counseled them through their divorces, comforted them in their grief, and held their babies during baptism was the same man who had left a teenager to bleed to death in a dark ditch was a psychological trauma from which the town would never truly recover. The betrayal wasn't just physical, it was cosmic, a shattering of the moral universe that left an entire community wondering if anything they had ever believed in was real, or if their entire lives had been guided by a wolf in shepherd's clothing. Behind the closed doors of the interrogation room, the facade of the righteous, holy man began to crack and splinter under the relentless pressure of prosecutors who laid out 40 years of evidence alongside the digital certainty of the DNA match. Sterling sat beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, his pristine suit jacket removed, his sleeves rolled up to reveal arms that had once been strong enough to overpower a terrified teenager in the dark of a Texas night. For hours, he maintained his pastoral tone, speaking of forgiveness, of trials sent by the adversary, and of the grand redemption that awaits all sinners, trying to turn the interrogation into a sermon to shield his ego from the reality of his ruin. But when Detective Lynn pushed the crime scene photographs across the table, stark, high-contrast images of Becky's frozen, pale face and the deep, dark gash across her throat, his voice faltered, the holy cadence dropping away to reveal the raw, jagged edge of a psychopath's true nature. He looked at the photo of the Winston cigarette butt, the piece of trash he had carelessly dropped 40 years ago when he thought he was a god who could dictate who lived and who died in his small kingdom. A slow, terrifying smile crept across his lips, a grotesque expression that had nothing to do with the grace of God and everything to do with the dark, hidden thrill of a secret held for a lifetime, as he realized that the game was finally over and the curtain had come crashing down on his grand performance. He began to speak, not in the booming register of the pulpit, but in a low, monotone whisper that was recorded by the studio microphones, a confession that detailed the absolute randomness and cold malice of that October night in 1985. He admitted that he didn't even know Becky Vance personally back then. He was just a young, angry man filled with a dark, boiling urge that he couldn't control, a desire to possess and destroy something pure before he hid his sickness behind the ultimate shield of religious devotion. He described how he followed her from the football field, how the smell of the damp pine needles had heightened his senses, and how he had felt a surge of absolute, godlike power as he extinguished her life, a feeling he spent the next 40 years hiding behind his sermons on morality and sin. He confessed that his entire pastoral career was built on the energy of that murder, that every time he preached about the devil, he was looking inward, using the guilt and fear of the town to build a fortress of power and respectability that no one would ever dare to question. He had used the town's grief as fuel for his own ambition, turning Becky's tragedy into his own stepping stone to ultimate authority, living a double life so perfectly segregated that he had almost convinced himself that the boy in the ditch in 1985 was a different man entirely. The Kitsch Band of Oakhaven is now written in the history books not as a story of faith, but as a monument to the terrifying capacity of human deception, a warning that the greatest monsters are often those who speak loudest about righteousness. The First Baptist Church stands empty now, its windows boarded up, its grand steeple casting a long, dark shadow across a town square that has fallen into a deep, permanent silence, the congregation scattered and broken by a grief that can never be comforted. Becky Vance's family received the news in their distant home, a bittersweet justice that arrived far too late to heal the decades of ruined lives and empty chairs, but a final, absolute confirmation that their daughter's killer had not escaped the long, grinding wheels of truth. The pine woods of East Texas still whisper when the autumn wind blows through Route 9, but the air feels different now, cleared of the heavy, suffocating mystery that choked the community for 40 long years. The rusted drainage ditch remains a quiet scar on the landscape, a stark reminder that no matter how deep an atrocity is buried, no matter how holy the disguise worn by the perpetrator, the truth remains waiting in the dark, carried on a microscopic strand of life, ready to tear down the temples of the wicked and bring the ghosts of the past home for their final, terrifying reckoning. The damp, clinging heat of the East Texas piney woods does something to a secret. It doesn't let it dry out. It just lets it rot at an agonizingly slow pace beneath layers of fallen needles and black loam. To truly understand the psychological devastation of October 1985, one must understand Oak Haven itself, a town built on the twin pillars of timber and total, unyielding devotion to the church. It was the kind of place where a person's word was verified by their presence in the pews every Sunday morning, where the sheriff didn't lock the jail cells because the occupants were usually just local boys who had taken a drop too much moonshine down by the creek. The houses were mostly single-story clapboard structures with wide porches, their paint peeling under the fierce southern sun, sitting back from roads that quickly dissolved from asphalt into red clay the moment you left the town square. In 1985, the town was already struggling against the slow economic decay that was eating away at rural America, but what kept the community alive was its absolute, fierce insularity. They took care of their own, they judged their own, and they buried their own without ever asking for outside help from the state authorities or the big city detectives in Houston. This fierce independence became their ultimate vulnerability when a predatory wolf decided to don the finest fleece available and settle directly into the heart of their fold, watching them with calculating eyes while they wept. Becky Vance was the very embodiment of everything Oak Haven cherished. She was innocent, vibrant, and possessed a quiet, respectful grace that made every mother in the county wish for a daughter just like her. At 16, her life was a predictable, comforting rhythm of school spirit, youth group meetings, and helping her mother prepare preserves for the county fair. On that fateful Friday night, the stadium lights of the Oak Haven High Tigers were a blinding, artificial sun cutting through the dense autumn mist, casting long, dramatic shadows across the freshly cut grass. The air was thick with the scent of popcorn, deep fryer grease, and the sharp, metallic tang of the coming winter, a classic Texas tableau that should have been the backdrop for a teenage memory, not a slaughter. Becky had stayed late to help the cheer squad pack away the heavy canvas banners and spirit flags, her laughter echoing down the empty concrete corridors of the stadium long after the crowds had filed out into the gravel parking lot. When she finally waved goodbye to her friends, she chose the shortcut, a narrow, dirt path that wound behind the dark school bus barn, cut through a thicket of ancient oaks, and emerged onto the lonely stretch of Route 9 just half a mile from her front door. It was a path she had walked 100 times before, a path where she felt entirely safe because, in her innocent mind, the dark was just the absence of light, not a hiding place for human malice. The physical terrain of that shortcut was a tactical dream for a hunter who had studied the movements of his prey with the meticulous patience of an apex predator. The path was bordered on one side by a high, chain-link fence that enclosed the school's maintenance yard, and on the other by a dense, impenetrable wall of wild blackberry brambles and thick pine saplings. Once a person entered that middle stretch, they were effectively trapped in a narrow corridor of shadow, completely invisible from both the high school stadium and the main highway. The ground here was soft, a carpet of decaying organic matter that muffled footsteps, allowing someone to glide through the dark with absolute, terrifying silence. The ambient noise of the night, the rhythmic, mechanical thrum of a distant oil derrick, the high-pitched chirping of cicadas, and the rustle of the wind through the canopy, provided the perfect acoustic camouflage for an ambush. The killer didn't just stumble upon Becky that night. He had positioned himself exactly where the illumination from the last stadium light died out, standing motionless in a pocket of absolute blackness, listening to the rhythmic slap of her sneakers against the damp earth as she approached. The sheer physical mechanics of the attack, as reconstructed decades later by forensic experts, revealed a chilling level of anatomical knowledge and a total absence of hesitation. There was no evidence of a prolonged struggle, no signs that Becky had been able to scream or run. The strike was executed with a swift, devastating precision that suggested the killer had practiced the movement in his mind 1,000 times before. He had stepped out from behind a massive oak trunk, catching her entirely by surprise, his left arm pinning her arms to her chest while his right hand, wielding a blade of exceptional sharpness, delivered a single, deep, horizontal sweep across her throat. The physical layout of the injuries indicated that he stood behind her, using his height and leverage to control her movements instantly, ensuring that her life force was drained in a matter of seconds into the thirsty soil. He didn't molest her, he didn't rifle through her pockets for money, and he didn't steal her jewelry. The act itself was the destination, a pure manifestation of absolute authority over another human being's existence. After she collapsed into the weeds, he dragged her body down the steep embankment into the rusted drainage ditch, rolling her over onto her back with a cold, detached finality before stepping back into the shadows to light a cigarette. That cigarette, a standard, filter-tipped Winston, became the ultimate monument to the killer's supreme arrogance, a physical manifestation of his belief that he was entirely untouchable by the laws of man or God. In 1985, smoking was so ubiquitous in rural Texas that a discarded butt at a crime scene was barely considered a premier piece of evidence. It was treated almost like a naturally occurring element of the landscape, like a piece of gravel or a fallen leaf. The killer stood there in the dark, the tiny orange ember of his cigarette illuminating his face for a fraction of a second with every drag, watching the pool of crimson widen beneath the girl's pale neck. He smoked it down to the brown paper band, his lips leaving behind a microscopic smear of saliva that contained the entire, unbroken code of his genetic identity, a digital time bomb set for 40 years in the future. When he finished, he didn't crush it beneath his heel or bury it in the mud. He simply dropped it from his fingers, letting it fall into a small cluster of wild clover just 3 feet from Becky's right hand. It was an act of casual, almost contemptuous indifference, the behavior of a man who looked at the local police force as a collection of bumbling country hicks who couldn't catch a cold, let alone a killer who wore the invisible armor of absolute respectability. The following morning, Saturday, October 26th, broke cold and gray, a heavy fog rolling off the Sabine River and blanketing Oakhaven in a chilly, opaque shroud that refused to lift. The alarm was raised at 6 a.m. when Arthur Vance, Becky's father, walked into her bedroom to find her bed undisturbed, the floral sheets perfectly crisp and the small white Bible on her nightstand unopened. Arthur was a hard-working mechanic who spent his days covered in grease and his nights studying scripture. He wasn't a man given to panic, but the sight of that empty bed sent a cold, instinctual spike of dread straight into his heart. Within an hour, half the town had joined a makeshift search party, their pickup trucks lining the gravel shoulders of Route 9, their headlights cutting yellow tunnels through the dense, milk-white fog. It was a local farmer, a man named Jesse Miller, who finally found her while looking for a lost calf down by the drainage ditch. His terrified, guttural screams shattered the morning silence, a sound that those who heard it said didn't sound human at all, but like the cry of a wounded animal. When Sheriff Thomas Miller arrived at the scene, the situation immediately deteriorated into a chaotic nightmare of procedural incompetence and collective hysteria. The sheriff was a heavy-set, good-natured man who had held his office for 12 years primarily because he was excellent at settling land disputes and knew exactly which local boys to give a stern warning to instead of a jail sentence. He had never seen a homicide of this nature, an act of such cold-blooded, calculated savagery, and his immediate reaction was one of visible, physical illness. He failed to establish a proper perimeter, allowing dozens of frantic neighbors, distraught schoolmates, and weeping church members to crowd around the lip of the ditch, their heavy work boots trampling the soft, muddy ground and obliterating potential footprints. The local coroner, who also operated the town's only funeral home and had no formal training in forensic pathology, handled the body with a clumsy, hurried reverence, anxious to get the girl out of the mud and away from the staring eyes of the crowd. In their haste to preserve the town's modesty and shield the family from the full horror of the scene, they washed away a wealth of trace evidence that modern crime scene technicians would have spent days meticulously harvesting with vacuum filters and laser lights. Amidst this swirling vortex of grief and confusion, Thomas Sterling, then a 24-year-old seminary student who had recently been hired as the youth director at the First Baptist Church, was the most active, visible figure of comfort on the scene. He had arrived with the Vance family, his arm wrapped tightly around Arthur Vance's shaking shoulders, his deep, resonant voice murmuring prayers of strength and deliverance over the roar of the police radios. Sterling was a striking young man, tall and broad-shouldered, with eyes of an intense, piercing blue that seemed to hold an infinite depth of compassion and understanding. While others turned away from the horrific sight in the ditch, Sterling looked directly at the scene, his face a mask of solemn, holy grief, though a modern behavioral profiler watching the old VHS home video footage of that morning would notice something deeply unsettling. His breathing was perfectly regular, his skin lacked the pale, clammy sheen of true shock, and his hands, when he raised them to lead the gathering in a spontaneous rendition of Amazing Grace, were as steady as carved marble. He was a man playing a role, delivering a performance of epic proportions on a stage that he had personally drenched in blood just 12 hours prior. As the sun finally burned through the fog that afternoon, the sheer scale of the community's psychological rupture became apparent at the local diner, the Rocking R, which served as the unofficial town hall. The room was packed to capacity, the air thick with the smell of burnt coffee and stale tobacco, but the usual boisterous chatter was replaced by a low, paranoid murmur that sounded like a hive of disturbed hornets. Every eye that looked across a table was filled with a new, corrosive suspicion. People who had known each other for 30 years were suddenly reevaluating every eccentric habit, every past argument, and every strange look their neighbors had ever given them. The primary theory, pushed heavily by the sheriff to deflect from his own lack of progress, was that a migratory construction worker from the oil fields down south had done the deed. It was a comforting lie that allowed the town to avoid looking into the mirror, a psychological shield that protected them from the unthinkable reality that the monster was someone they broke bread with every Sunday. They wanted to believe in an outside threat, a phantom from the highway, because the alternative meant that the very fabric of their safe Christian community was a lethal illusion. The initial investigation was a textbook example of a dead end built on a foundation of archaic methods and cultural biases. The sheriff's department spent weeks chasing phantoms, interviewing hitchhikers who had been spotted 5 miles away on the interstate, tracking down a traveling carnival that had passed through the next county over, and interrogating a lonely, mentally disabled man who lived in a shack near the tracks. This poor soul, Billy Jenkins, became the town's primary scapegoat for a month. He was subjected to hours of intense, aggressive questioning without an attorney, the detectives trying to force a confession out of a man who couldn't even remember what he had eaten for breakfast. Billy wept. He confessed to things he couldn't possibly have done, and he begged to go home to his mother, but the physical evidence simply wouldn't stick. There were no scratches on his arms, his clothes showed no trace of Becky's blood type, and his timeline, verified by 3 independent witnesses who had seen him watching television at the local laundromat, ultimately forced the sheriff to release him. The town was furious. They wanted a monster in chains, and when Billy was let go, a dark, vigilante undercurrent began to simmer through the backwoods, with men carrying shotguns in their gun racks and talking about taking the law into their own hands if the police couldn't find the butcher. During this period of intense public anger, Thomas Sterling's influence in Oakhaven began its meteoric, terrifying rise. The senior pastor of the First Baptist Church, an elderly man named Reverend Davies, was completely broken by the tragedy. His health failed rapidly under the stress, his sermons becoming rambling, incoherent lamentations that offered no comfort to a terrified flock. Sterling stepped into the vacuum with a ferocious, magnetic energy that captivated the entire county. He didn't preach about a distant, passive God. He preached about a warrior Christ, a Lord of justice who would root out the wickedness that had infected their paradise. His sermons were masterpieces of psychological manipulation. He would weave descriptions of Becky's innocence together with fiery denunciations of modern secular culture, television, and the creeping moral decay of the big cities. He made the congregation feel that they were under siege by demonic forces, and that he, and he alone, possessed the spiritual authority to lead them through the wilderness. He organized the young men of the town into neighborhood watch groups, effectively controlling the public safety narrative and ensuring that any independent curiosity about the murder was funneled directly through him. He became the town's protector, its spiritual general, while the single Winston cigarette filter lay inside a small glass jar in a cardboard box on the bottom shelf of the county evidence locker, its microscopic secret slowly drying out, waiting for a future that Sterling never believed would arrive. The absolute BTAC of the case was officially formalized in October 1986, on the one-year anniversary of the murder. The sheriff held a brief, defensive press conference where he admitted that all leads had been exhausted, that the tip line had gone completely silent, and that without new evidence, the file would be classified as inactive. The announcement was met with a grim, resigned silence from the community. The paranoia had morphed over 12 months into a heavy, permanent cynicism that altered the very DNA of Oakhaven. The shortcut behind the stadium was permanently closed, blocked off by a massive, 6-foot chain-link fence topped with barbed wire, left to be overtaken by wild vines and weeds until the path itself disappeared from view, much like the memory of the girl who died there. The high school cheerleaders no longer wore their uniforms outside of the school grounds, and the Friday night football games lost their celebratory, festive atmosphere, turning into tense, tightly guarded events where parents stood at the edges of the stands with their eyes scanned constantly on the dark tree line. The town had survived the storm by wrapping itself in a shroud of collective amnesia, burying the trauma deep within their subconscious minds, unaware that their wound was not healing. It was simply festering under a thick layer of holy gauze applied by the very hand that had cut them open. The transition of Oakhaven from a community paralyzed by raw, immediate terror to one encapsulated in a permanent, calcified silence took less than 3 years. By 1988, the name Becky Vance had shifted from a headline into an unspoken taboo, a conversational boundary line that no local dared to cross during backyard barbecues or after-church luncheons. It was as if speaking her name aloud might invite the shadow back into the town square, or worse, force the residents to acknowledge that the butcher was still walking among them, breathing the same humid air and buying groceries from the same local market. This collective amnesia wasn't accidental. It was a carefully cultivated social contract, enforced by a community that simply could not afford to collapse under the weight of an internal threat. The local police department, content to let the file gather dust rather than expose their own systemic failures, gladly participated in the lockdown, filing away supplemental reports into an iron safe that remained locked behind the sheriff's heavy oak desk. The case wasn't just cold, it was frozen solid beneath a thick, impenetrable sheet of cultural denial, a fortress of silence built to protect the living at the absolute expense of the dead. At the epicenter of this protective masonry stood Thomas Sterling, whose transition from a temporary youth director to the fully ordained senior pastor of the First Baptist Church was finalized in the winter of 1989. The old Reverend Davies had passed away in his sleep, his heart finally giving out after years of carrying a grief he could neither heal nor understand, leaving the keys to the kingdom to his charismatic young protege. Sterling didn't just take the pulpit. He conquered it, transforming the modest brick church into a sprawling, multi-acre complex that dominated the local landscape both physically and spiritually. He possessed an uncanny, almost supernatural ability to read the collective anxieties of his flock, tailoring his weekly messages to provide an intoxicating mix of absolute moral certainty and deep, emotional comfort. Under his guidance, the church grew from 100 elderly congregants to a thriving megachurch of over 3,000 members, drawing families from 3 neighboring counties who were desperate for a leader who didn't compromise with the changing, modern world. He was more than a preacher. He was a political kingmaker, a civic leader, and the absolute moral arbiter of Oakhaven, a man whose endorsement could secure a judgeship or ruin a local business with a single, casual comment from the altar. The psychological mechanics of Sterling's double life during this decade were a masterclass in clinical compartmentalization, a feat of cognitive engineering that allowed him to exist simultaneously as a saint and a monster without ever cracking under the pressure. In his study, a grand, wood-paneled room filled with ancient theological texts and expensive leather chairs, he spent hours preparing sermons on the absolute sanctity of life and the terrifying reality of divine judgment. He would sit beneath a massive, hand-carved wooden cross, his fingers tracing the fine edges of his fountain pen as he wrote paragraphs about the necessity of pure thoughts and the insidious nature of hidden sin. Yet, inside the secret, locked drawer of his heavy mahogany desk, tucked beneath a layer of financial audits and church deeds, lay a small, tarnished silver charm, a tiny cheerleader megaphone that he had snipped from Becky Vance's charm bracelet before he dragged her into the mud in 1985. It was his ultimate prize, a physical anchor to the night he had achieved total, godlike dominance over another human being, a token he would hold in his palm during the dead of night, drawing a dark, chaotic energy from it that fueled his hypnotic performances on Sunday mornings. The contrast between the public saint and the private ghoul was never more apparent than during the annual Oakhaven Fall Festival, an event Sterling had personally rescued from financial ruin and turned into the church's premier community outreach program. Every October, the church grounds were transformed into a vibrant, swirling carnival of lights, laughter, and autumn colors, with hundreds of children playing in hayrides and bobbing for apples under the crisp Texas sky. Sterling was always the life of the festival, walking through the crowds with a booming laugh, his expensive wool coat slung over his shoulder as he kissed babies, shook hands with local cattlemen, and helped old widows carry their prize-winning pies to the judging tables. He was the picture of wholesome, small-town American righteousness, a man who seemed to radiate a genuine, infectious love for his community. Yet, every year, on the exact night of October 25th, at precisely 10:15 p.m., the estimated time of Becky's death, Sterling would slip away from the roaring bonfire and the singing crowds, walking out into the dark parking lot to sit alone in his luxury sedan. He would light a single Winston cigarette, roll down the window to let the cold night air fill the cabin, and stare across the dark highway toward the distant, abandoned tree line where the shortcut used to be, savoring the memory of her final, desperate gasps for air with a cold, calm serenity that would have terrified his most devoted deacons. Meanwhile, the Vance family was experiencing a very different kind of isolation, a slow, agonizing social excommunication that often befalls the victims of unsolved atrocities in small, insular towns. For the first 2 years after the murder, neighbors had brought casseroles, mowed their lawn, and sat with them in their grief, but as the months turned into years without an arrest, the community's empathy began to curdle into a strange, defensive resentment. The presence of Arthur and Martha Vance at the grocery store or the post office was a living, breathing reminder of the town's failure, a crack in the pristine facade of Oakhaven that people desperately wanted to forget. Conversations would die out the moment Martha walked into a room. Old friends would suddenly find an urgent reason to turn down another aisle when they saw Arthur approaching. The implicit message from the town was clear: your tragedy is holding us back. Your refusal to move on is keeping the wound open. When Arthur openly criticized Sheriff Miller's investigation in a local newspaper interview in 1987, accusing the department of incompetence and laziness, the backlash from the community was immediate and severe. Boycotts were organized against his auto repair shop. Local banks suddenly refused to extend his business lines, and the family found themselves treated not as victims, but as pariahs who were actively trying to destroy the town's reputation. It was Pastor Sterling who ultimately engineered their departure from Oakhaven, a maneuver executed with such delicate, holy malice that the Vances viewed him as their sole savior during their final days in the county. Seeing that Arthur's stubborn refusal to abandon the search for his daughter's killer posed a long-term threat to his security, Sterling began a systematic pastoral counseling campaign targeted directly at the family's deep spiritual exhaustion. He visited their home every Thursday evening, sitting in their dim, silent living room where Becky's senior portrait still hung on the wall, draped in black silk. Sterling would read to them from the Book of Job, his voice a low, soothing hum that spoke of the vanity of human understanding and the necessity of total submission to the divine will. He told them that perhaps God's justice wasn't meant to be realized on this corrupted earth, that by clinging to their anger and their demand for earthly vengeance, they were trapping Becky's soul in a state of unrest and endangering their own salvation. He painted a beautiful, seductive picture of a new beginning, a clean slate far away from the painful reminders of Oakhaven, offering to use church funds to purchase their home and help them relocate to a quiet retirement community near the New Mexico border. Broken, bankrupt, and spiritually drained, the Van Cess finally surrendered to his gentle pressure, packing their lives into a U-Haul trailer in the spring of 1990, leaving the keys to their home in the hands of the man who had torn their family to pieces. With the Van Cess gone, the last physical link to the crime was effectively severed, allowing Sterling to consolidate his power over the county without the slightest fear of exposure. The 1990s were a golden age of expansion for the First Baptist Church. Sterling launched a regional television broadcast that reached hundreds of thousands of homes across Texas and Louisiana, turning his handsome face and booming voice into a household staple of Sunday morning programming. He wrote books on family values and spiritual warfare, became a regular consultant for state politicians seeking the evangelical vote, and built a private academy on the church grounds that educated the children of the town's elite under his strict, personal curriculum. He was completely untouchable, surrounded by a multi-layered fortress of administrative assistants, security personnel, and fiercely loyal deacons who viewed any criticism of their pastor as a direct attack on God himself. The local police department, now led by a succession of sheriffs who had grown up watching Sterling on television and whose campaigns were heavily funded by church members, viewed the First Baptist Church as an extension of the law, a partner in maintaining the pristine, crime-free status of the county. Yet, inside the climate-controlled basement of the newly constructed County Justice Center, the physical reality of October 1985 refused to completely dissolve, surviving through a bizarre series of bureaucratic oversights and the quiet diligence of an old records clerk named Henry Potts. Henry was a man of lines and ledgers, a meticulous, obsessive-compulsive veteran of the Korean War who viewed the preservation of county records as a sacred trust. When the old sheriff's office was demolished in 1995 to make way for the modern facility, Henry was tasked with transferring thousands of evidence boxes from the old damp basement to the new automated rolling shelves. Most of the deputies wanted to incinerate the older, inactive files from unsolved cases to save space, but Henry refused, matching every box against the master historical ledger with a stubborn, bureaucratic ferocity. Box 85 to 1042, containing the faded Polaroids of the drainage ditch, Becky's blood-stained canvas backpack, and the small glass vial holding the Winston cigarette filter, was placed on shelf 14, row D, completely forgotten by the world but perfectly preserved in a constant 68 degrees and 40% humidity, an environmental sweet spot that kept the killer's biological signature from degrading into useless dust. As the millennium turned, the world outside Oakhaven began to change at a dizzying, terrifying speed, with technology advancing in ways that Sterling, for all his intelligence, could not fully comprehend or anticipate. The rise of commercial internet databases, the digitalization of public records, and the birth of forensic DNA profiling were shifting the ground beneath his feet, though he remained blissfully unaware of the danger from his high pulpit. To him, DNA was something used in high-profile capital cases in Houston or Dallas, a tool for modern crimes, not a supernatural force that could reach back through 20, 30, then 40 years of history to pull a man down from his throne. He had watched the news of the Green River Killer's arrest in 2001 with a detached, professional curiosity, even preaching a sermon the following Sunday about how the sins of the flesh will always find a man out, completely secure in his belief that his own crime was uniquely protected by its age, its location, and the absolute perfection of his holy disguise. He had outlived the original detectives, he had buried the victim's parents, he had purchased the land where the murder took place and paved it over with a modern church parking lot. He had conquered time itself, or so he believed, As he celebrated his 25th anniversary as senior pastor in 2014, receiving a standing ovation from 5,000 people who cheered for a man they believed was the closest thing to Jesus Christ to ever walk the state of Texas. The true nature of his security, however, was a fragile illusion built on the assumption that the past remained static, a fatal mistake that overlooked the explosive evolution of consumer genetic science in the 2020s. Millions of ordinary people around the globe, driven by nothing more than harmless curiosity about their lineage or a desire to find distant relatives, were spitting into small plastic tubes and mailing them to companies like Ancestry DNA and 23andMe. These companies were building massive, interconnected digital oceans of genetic data, maps of human relationships so vast and detailed that they effectively eliminated the concept of genetic anonymity. It no longer mattered if a criminal had never committed another crime, if he had never been booked into a police station, or if his fingerprints were missing from the national registries. If a second cousin in Ohio or a great-niece in Oregon uploaded their DNA to find out if they were related to European royalty, they were unknowingly dropping a breadcrumb trail that led straight to the darkest secrets of their family tree. The noose was being braided in cyberspace, constructed from billions of base pairs of public data, moving silently across the fiber-optic cables of the nation, closing in on the Grand Rectory in Oakhaven where Thomas Sterling sat counting his blessings, completely blind to the digital storm that was about to erase his life. The shift from physical legwork to algorithmic hunting happened so quietly that the gatekeepers of Oakhaven's secrets never even noticed the gears beginning to turn. By the early 2020s, the field of forensic science had undergone a quiet, digital revolution, shifting its focus away from traditional local criminal registries and toward the vast, unregulated wilderness of consumer databases. In Austin, within the sterile, glass-walled confines of the Texas Department of Public Safety's specialized cold case unit, a new philosophy was taking root. The department was no longer just staffed by grizzled, cigarette-scarred detectives who relied on snitches and shoe leather. It was populated by data analysts, molecular biologists, and genetic genealogists who treated an unsolved murder not as a narrative puzzle, but as a mathematical equation waiting for the right computational inputs. This was a world where a 40-year-old atrocity could be broken down into a string of binary code, uploaded to a cloud server and cross-referenced with millions of ordinary civilian profiles across the globe in a matter of seconds. Sarah Lynn joined the unit in 2024 as a forensic geneticist, bringing with her a degree from Johns Hopkins and a deep, systematic frustration with the way old law enforcement structures handled cold cases. To her, every unsolved folder in the archive wasn't just a tragedy, it was an evidentiary failure waiting to be corrected by technological advancement. When she began her routine audit of the state's most stubborn mid-1980s homicides, the case of Becky Vance immediately drew her attention, not because of the sensationalized local reporting, but because of the pristine preservation of Box 85 to 1042. Thanks to the obsessive-compulsive filing system of the long-retired records clerk, Henry Potts, the biological material recovered from the Route 9 drainage ditch hadn't been exposed to the extreme heat or localized flooding that had ruined half the state's evidence repositories over the decades. The glass vial containing the single Winston cigarette filter sat in the dark, its sealed rubber stopper perfectly intact, protecting the microscopic fragments of dried saliva from modern environmental contamination. When Lynn pulled the vial from the box under a laminar flow hood, she wasn't looking for a traditional Cody's profile. She was aiming for something far more complex, single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. Traditional law enforcement DNA profiles look at short tandem repeats, STRs, at 20 specific loci on the human genome, a method that is incredibly effective if the suspect is already in a police database, but entirely useless if the killer has lived a law-abiding life ever since. An SNP profile, however, examines over 600,000 variations across the entire genome, constructing a massive, high-definition genetic map that can predict eye color, hair texture, biogeographical ancestry, and most importantly, distant familial relationships out to fifth and sixth cousins. The extraction process was an agonizing, high-stakes operation. The saliva on the 40-year-old paper filter was sparse and highly degraded, requiring a cutting-edge technique known as whole genome sequencing to amplify the broken strands of DNA without introducing artificial errors into the sequence. For 6 days, the sequencing machines in the Austin lab hummed continuously, utilizing massive computing power to read and reread the fragmented DNA strands, slowly stitching the ancient genetic puzzle back together into a single, cohesive digital file. When the final report was generated on Lynn's terminal, it was a flawless, ultra-pure genomic profile, an absolute digital replica of the biological signature left behind by the killer in the dark woods of Oakhaven in October 1985. Lynn ran the profile through Cody's First, a mandatory legal formality that yielded exactly what she expected: nothing. The killer had never been arrested for a felony, never served time in a state or federal penitentiary, and had never been forced to provide a cheek swab to the government. He was a phantom to the traditional criminal justice system, a man who had successfully navigated 40 years of life without ever leaving a footprint in a police station. But Lynn's true weapon wasn't Cody's. It was GEDmatch and Family Tree Day, public-facing genealogical platforms where ordinary citizens uploaded their data to map out their family trees. The moment Lynn uploaded the killer's digital profile into the genealogical databases, the algorithm began its relentless, invisible work, scanning millions of data points to find chunks of matching DNA that indicated a shared ancestor. In the mid-1980s, a killer could vanish into a crowd by simply changing his clothes or moving to the next town over. But in the digital landscape of 2026, a criminal is permanently tethered to every single person who shares his bloodline. Within 3 minutes of the upload, the screen lit up with a series of high-probability matches, none of them direct hits, but rather a constellation of genetic relatives scattered across the United States. The closest match was a 42-year-old elementary school teacher living in Portland, Oregon, named Clara Higgins, who had uploaded her DNA 6 months prior to find her maternal grandfather's lineage. The algorithm calculated that Clara shared approximately 3.4% of her DNA with the unidentified Texas killer, a mathematical correlation that placed her squarely in the category of a second cousin once removed. To an untrained eye, a second cousin in Oregon might seem like another dead end, but to a skilled genetic genealogist, it was the first thread of a web that could be spun backward to catch a monster. Lynn began the grueling process of reverse genealogy, a technique that involves taking the family tree of the living match and building it backward to find the common ancestors, then tracing every branch of those ancestors' descendants forward to the present day. Working alongside a small team of research analysts, Lynn spent weeks digging through digital birth certificates, marriage licenses, military draft cards, and local census records from the early 20th century. They traced Clara Higgins' lineage back to her great-grandparents, a farming couple named Silas and Martha Sterling, who had owned a small homestead in the rolling hills of Deep East Texas during the 1920s and 30s. Silas and Martha had 5 children, 4 boys and 1 girl, creating a vast, sprawling familial network that planted deep roots into the timber country surrounding the Sabine River. The investigation now had a surname and a geographic anchor: Sterling. Lynn printed out a massive, 30-foot family tree, taping it to the glass walls of the cold case unit's war room, using red markers to trace every male descendant who would have been of sound physical age and presence in East Texas in October 1985. The process of elimination was a cold, mathematical slaughter of innocent names. One branch of the family had migrated to California during the Dust Bowl, permanently cutting ties with the state. Another brother had served in the Vietnam War and suffered debilitating injuries that left him confined to a specialized VA hospital in San Antonio until his death in 1982. Branch by branch, leaf by leaf, the tree was pruned of its impossibilities until the genetic crosshairs converged on a single household that had remained in the immediate vicinity of Oakhaven during the mid-1980s, the family of James and Evelyn Sterling. James and Evelyn had 3 sons: Arthur, Robert, and Thomas. All 3 boys had grown up in the county, attended Oakhaven High School, and were physically present in the town during the autumn of 1985. To Lynn, this was the moment the room lost its air. The mathematical certainty of the DNA was no longer pointing to a hypothetical stranger, but to 3 specific men whose lives were deeply woven into the local soil. The unit immediately launched a deep-dive background check on the 3 brothers, utilizing a massive array of digital databases to reconstruct their lives, their movements, and their financial records from 40 years ago. They discovered that Arthur, the oldest brother, had been a heavy drinker who died in a head-on collision on Route 9 in 1992, his medical records from the county hospital still preserved in a microfilm archive. Lynn managed to track down Arthur's surviving daughter, who was living in Dallas, and under the guise of a routine historical inquiry, obtained a voluntary DNA sample. The results were conclusive. Arthur's genetic profile did not contain the specific chromosomal configurations found on the Winston cigarette filter. He was cleared. The second brother, Robert, had enlisted in the United States Marine Corps immediately after graduating high school in 1983. The team pulled his military service records from the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, discovering an ironclad, unshakable alibi that even the most aggressive prosecutor couldn't question. In October 1985, Robert's battalion was deployed aboard the USS Tarawa in the middle of the western Pacific Ocean, thousands of miles away from the damp pine woods of East Texas. His daily duty logs, signed by his commanding officer, placed him on a helicopter maintenance deck during the exact weekend Becky Vance was taken from the world. Robert was eliminated from the ledger of suspicion, leaving only one name remaining at the end of the genealogical pipeline, a name that made Detective Lynn stare at her terminal screen for 45 minutes, without blinking. Thomas Sterling, the youngest brother. The man who hadn't run away to the military, who hadn't died in a drunken car wreck, but who had stayed behind to build a monumental empire of faith on the very ground where the victim's blood had soaked into the red clay. When Lynn pulled up his current digital file, she was greeted by a wall of pristine, curated public relations material, photographs of a handsome, silver-haired patriarch standing before a congregation of thousands, videos of his booming, emotionally charged television sermons, listings of his multi-million-dollar church properties, and his extensive civic charity work. He was a man of absolute, unassailable power, a holy figure who had spent 40 years counseling the broken and burying the dead, yet the mathematics of his own blood were now singing a song of absolute damnation. The administrative reaction within the Texas Department of Public Safety to this discovery was one of immediate, paralyzing panic. This wasn't just a standard arrest. This was a political and social landmine that could blow the roof off the entire county justice system if handled incorrectly. If the cold case unit moved against a figure as prominent as Pastor Thomas Sterling with anything less than 100% certainty, the public backlash, fueled by his thousands of fiercely loyal followers and political allies in Austin, would destroy the unit and ruin the careers of everyone involved. The director of public safety was called into a closed-door briefing, the blinds drawn tightly, as Lynn presented the genetic data, the family tree, and the elimination profiles that left Sterling as the sole, mathematically undeniable source of the DNA on that Winston cigarette. The directive from the top brass was clear, uncompromising, and heavy with tension. You do not touch him, you do not talk to his associates, and you do not file for a formal search warrant until you have a fresh, direct, matching sample of his DNA secured in a laboratory vial. They needed a current genetic profile, obtained without his knowledge, to verify the genealogical data before a single pair of handcuffs could be unholstered. The unit was ordered to transition from an analytical data hunt to a highly classified, boots-on-the-ground surveillance operation, sending a team of undercover operatives into the heart of Oak Haven to shadow the pastor's every move, waiting for the single, careless moment where the holy man would discard a piece of trash containing his current genetic signature. The trap was set, the digital noose was tight, but the monster was still sitting in his temple, completely unaware that the smoke from a 40-year-old cigarette had finally drifted across the decades to choke out his light. The shadowing of a saint. The air in Oak Haven during the first week of May 2026 was heavy with the scent of blooming honeysuckle and the underlying, metallic tang of an approaching Gulf storm. To the casual observer, the town was moving at its usual, glacial southern pace. Old men sipping sweet tea on the porch of the hardware store, logging trucks rumbling down the bypass, and the great bells of the First Baptist Church chiming out their hourly hymns across the manicured lawns. But beneath this placid exterior, a quiet, deadly serious infiltration was taking place. A specialized surveillance team from the Texas Department of Public Safety had slipped into the county, operating out of a nondescript, windowless white utility van parked in the gravel lot of a closed-down tractor dealership on Route 9. They wore the uniforms of local broadband technicians, carried tool belts, and drove trucks equipped with standard ladders, but their eyes were fixed entirely on the grand, brick rectory where Pastor Thomas Sterling conducted the business of his multi-million-dollar ministry. The team was led by investigator Marcus Vance, no relation to the victim, a bureaucratic coincidence that the team found both ironic and deeply unsettling. Marcus was a veteran of the state's narcotics division, a man who had spent his career tracking cartel couriers and high-level money launderers through the neon-soaked streets of Houston and Dallas. He understood the art of the invisible stakeout, the meticulous science of disappearing into the background of a target's daily routine. Yet, as he sat in the suffocating heat of the surveillance van, staring at the high-definition monitor that displayed the front entrance of the church offices, he felt a cold, professional tension that he hadn't experienced in a decade. They weren't tracking a low-life street criminal who might bolt at the sight of a police badge. They were hunting an absolute king, a man surrounded by a wall of fanatical devotion, whose single call to the governor's office could potentially derail their entire operation if they were spotted. The operational parameters laid down by the district attorney in Austin were mercilessly strict, absolute passive observation. The team was forbidden from using traditional investigative techniques that might trigger Sterling's survival instincts. They couldn't interview his former employees, they couldn't run a financial audit on his church accounts, and they couldn't even request a standard trash pull from his residential curb, as the local waste management company was owned by one of the church's senior deacons. A single anomalous event, a strange car parked too long down his private lane, a utility worker asking too many specific questions about his schedule, would be picked up by his extensive private security detail, a force composed mostly of retired county deputies who viewed protecting the pastor as a holy crusade. The mission lived or died on a single objective: securing a fresh sample of Thomas Sterling's biological material without him ever knowing he was being watched. For the first 4 days, the surveillance log was a monotonous catalog of pristine, unassailable righteousness. At exactly 6:30 a.m. every morning, the heavy wooden doors of the pastor's residence would swing open, and Sterling would emerge, looking every bit the modern prophet in a perfectly pressed linen shirt and dark slacks. He would spend 45 minutes walking the perimeter of the church's private prayer garden, his leather-bound Bible held flat against his palm, his lips moving in silent, fervent devotion as he watched the sunrise break through the ancient oak trees. Marcus watched him through a 500mm telephoto lens, analyzing his body language with the intensity of a predator. Sterling moved with a smooth, effortless grace that defied his 65 years, his shoulders back, his silver hair catching the morning light like a halo. There was no visible sign of a guilty conscience, no nervous glances over his shoulder, no somatic tics that suggested a man carrying the memory of a teenager bleeding to death in a muddy ditch. He looked like a man who slept with the peace of the angels, a realization that made Marcus's stomach turn over with a deep, visceral disgust. At 8:15 a.m., Sterling would transition to his administrative duties, his luxury German sedan gliding across the smooth asphalt of the church parking lot to his private executive suite at the rear of the sanctuary. The team had installed a directional microphone on a nearby telephone pole, allowing them to capture the ambient audio of his arrivals and departures. They listened to his voice, a magnificent, resonant baritone that possessed a natural, soothing warmth, as he greeted his administrative assistants, joked with the groundskeepers about the local high school baseball scores, and blessed the various church members who waited in the lobby just to touch his hand. It was a flawless performance of accessible majesty, a masterclass in pastoral charisma that had been refined over 40 years of absolute control. Marcus sat in the dark van, listening to the audio stream, trying to reconcile that beautiful, comforting voice with the raw, jagged violence described in the 1985 autopsy report. It was like listening to a ghost story being narrated by a saint. The real difficulty began when the team realized that Sterling's daily hygiene habits were a fortress against trace evidence collection. He was an obsessively clean man, a trait that Marcus began to realize wasn't just a personal preference, but likely a deeply ingrained defense mechanism developed over decades of living as a secret predator. When he drank coffee during his morning meetings in the church conference room, he used a private, silver-rimmed porcelain mug that he personally washed and locked inside his private office cabinet before leaving for the day. When he blew his nose or wiped his brow during a particularly emotional counseling session, he used high-grade linen handkerchiefs that he folded neatly and slipped back into his breast pocket, never discarding them in the building's trash receptacles. Even his garbage at home was handled with a terrifying level of security. His private security guards would collect the bags from his kitchen door and place them directly into an on-site commercial incinerator used to destroy confidential church counseling records and financial documents. He was leaving nothing behind, leaving no genetic crumbs for the hunters who were circling his perimeter. The break in the monotony came on Friday, May 8th, a day that began with a sudden, suffocating shift in the weather as a heavy line of severe thunderstorms began to roll across deep East Texas. The sky turned an eerie, bruised shade of green-black, and the wind began to howl through the pine needles, shaking the utility van as Marcus and his partner, Detective Ramirez, monitored the target's movements. At 1:30 p.m., Sterling's luxury sedan pulled out of the church parking lot, moving at a high speed down Route 9, away from the center of town. The surveillance trucks followed at a discreet distance, utilizing a rotating system of vehicles to avoid catching the attention of the pastor's driver. Sterling was heading toward the county line, crossing into a desolate, rural stretch of timberland where the old family homesteads had long been abandoned to the encroaching wilderness. He pulled into the gravel lot of a small, dilapidated roadhouse called the Rusty Nail, a place that sat right on the border of the next jurisdiction, far away from the eyes of his Oakhaven congregation. The building was a low-slung, cinder-block structure with a rusted tin roof, surrounded by a fleet of muddy pickup trucks and logging rigs, the kind of place where men went to disappear into a cloud of neon beer signs and country music after a brutal shift in the woods. Marcus felt his pulse quicken as he watched the silver hair disappear through the heavy wooden door of the tavern. Why would the most prominent holy man in 3 counties, a man who regularly preached about the demonic nature of alcohol and the sin of worldly entertainment, enter a dim, smoke-filled dive bar on a Friday afternoon during a torrential downpour? Marcus immediately radioed Detective Lynn back in the Austin lab, his voice tight with excitement. Target has entered a non-secure environment. I'm going inactive. Ramirez checked his weapon, but Marcus shook his head. No badges, no leather jackets. We look like 2 oil field workers looking for a cold beer before the storm hits. They pulled on greasy canvas jackets, ruffled their hair, and walked through the driving rain, the heavy drops flattening the dust on the gravel lot as they pushed open the door of the tavern. The interior of the Rusty Nail was a dense, yellow fog of cheap tobacco smoke, fried grease, and the sharp, sour tang of stale beer. A jukebox in the corner was throwing out a low, mournful Hank Williams melody, its neon lights reflecting off the wet linoleum floor. Marcus and Ramirez took a table in a dark booth near the pool tables, their eyes scanning the room until they locked onto the target. Sterling was sitting alone in the furthest corner of the room, far away from the flickering television screen that was broadcasting the weather alerts. He had removed his expensive wool overcoat, revealing a plain black Western shirt underneath, his posture slouched in a way that Marcus had never seen before. The serene, authoritative presence he maintained at the pulpit was completely gone, replaced by a heavy, sullen exhaustion that made him look older, meaner, and entirely human. A waitress walked over to his table, and Marcus strained his ears over the noise of the jukebox to hear the order. Sterling didn't ask for a mineral water or a diet soda. He ordered a double shot of straight bourbon and a pack of Winston cigarettes. Marcus caught Ramirez's eye beneath the brim of his baseball cap. This was the hidden vice, the dark, secret valve that the pastor used to bleed off the immense psychological pressure of maintaining his holy lie. For 40 years, he had lived under the microscope of public adoration, a prisoner of his own perfect reputation, and this dim, anonymous roadhouse was the only place where he could drop the mask and let the rot breathe. When the waitress returned with the liquor and the smokes, Sterling didn't hesitate. He downed the bourbon in a single, practiced gulp, his hand completely steady as he set the empty glass down on the wooden table. Then, with a slow, almost ritualistic deliberate nature, he tore open the cellophane wrapper of the cigarette pack. He pulled out a single smoke, struck a wooden match against the side of the box, and brought the flame to the tip, inhaling deeply as the tip glowed a bright, angry orange in the shadows of the booth. He closed his eyes as the smoke filled his lungs, his face relaxing into an expression of pure, defiant satisfaction, the exact same expression he likely wore 40 years ago as he stood over the drainage ditch on Route 9, watching the life drain out of Becky Vance. Marcus sat perfectly still, his hands wrapped around a long-neck beer bottle he had no intention of drinking, his eyes fixed on the white paper cylinder between the pastor's fingers. This was it. The entire 40-year investigation, the digital algorithms, the family trees, the decades of ruined lives and silent grief, it all came down to the piece of paper and cotton currently touching the suspect's lips. If Sterling crushed the cigarette into an ashtray full of beer or took the butt with him when he left, the window would slam shut, and they would be forced back into the dark. Sterling smoked the cigarette down for 7 agonizing minutes, taking slow, measured drags while staring out the grease-stained window at the rain lashing against the pine trees outside. He didn't order a second drink. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crisp $20 bill, and dropped it onto the table to cover the tab. Then, with a casual flick of his wrist, he dropped the half-smoked Winston cigarette into a clean glass ashtray that sat in the middle of the table, stood up, and pulled his expensive coat back over his shoulders. He didn't look back as he walked out into the storm, the heavy wooden door clicking shut behind him as his luxury sedan roared to life in the gravel lot outside. Marcus didn't wait for the car to pull away. He slid out of the booth, his hand already reaching into his canvas jacket pocket for a pair of sterile latex gloves and a small, amber plastic evidence tube he had stolen from the forensic kit. He walked across the dim room with a smooth, unhurried pace, slipping into the corner booth before the waitress could arrive to clear the table. Under the cover of the shadows and the loud rumble of thunder outside, he picked up the discarded cigarette filter with absolute, surgical precision, sliding it into the plastic tube and twisting the cap until it locked with a sharp, definitive click. He looked down at the brown paper band, seeing the faint, damp mark where Sterling's saliva had soaked into the paper, a fresh, pristine reservoir of genetic damnation that would destroy the saint of Oakhaven within 48 hours. He slipped the tube into his pocket, looked at Ramirez, and gave a single, imperceptible nod. The shadow game was over. The science was about to begin. The biological countdown began the exact moment investigator Marcus Vance's unmarked vehicle cleared the gravel parking lot of the Rusty Nail, its windshield wipers slapping a frantic rhythm against the torrential East Texas rain. Inside the vehicle, the small amber plastic evidence tube sat on the passenger seat like a live grenade, carrying within its sterile walls the 40-year-old answer to Oakhaven's darkest nightmare. The drive back to the Texas Department of Public Safety's laboratory in Austin was conducted under a shroud of absolute radio silence. The surveillance team knew that the digital infrastructure of modern law enforcement was vulnerable to leaks, and a single stray comment over an encrypted channel could alert the powerful political allies who protected the sanctuary of Pastor Thomas Sterling. They drove straight through the night, the headlights cutting through the dense, blinding fog of the river bottoms, arriving at the rear security gate of the state forensic facility just as the first cold rays of a gray Saturday morning began to illuminate the state capitol. Sarah Lynn was already waiting in the restricted molecular biology wing, her lab coat crisp, her eyes bloodshot from a night spent calibrating the sequencing equipment to ensure there would not be a single nanogram of technical variance. The chain of custody transfer was executed with a solemn, bureaucratic precision that bordered on a religious ritual. Every signature was witnessed by 2 independent evidence technicians, every timestamp verified against the atomic clock, and the physical seal of the amber tube photographed at high magnification to prove that no contamination had occurred during transit. The cigarette filter, still smelling faintly of the cheap bourbon and stale tobacco of the Roadhouse, was placed beneath a sterile biological safety cabinet, where Lynn used a microscalpel to carefully shave away the outer paper layer, targeting the dense cotton core where the suspect's dried epithelial cells were trapped in abundance. The extraction process was a masterpiece of modern biochemistry, a multi-step sequence designed to isolate the human DNA molecules while washing away the toxic resins, tars, and chemical additives inherent to commercial cigarette smoke. Lynn introduced a specialized lysis buffer, a chemical solution that dissolves the outer cellular membranes to release the genetic material trapped within the nuclei, before placing the sample into a high-speed thermal centrifuge. For 4 hours, the liquid spun in a dizzying vortex, separating the heavy cellular debris from the pure, clear strands of nucleic acid until a tiny, invisible pellet of DNA settled at the bottom of the polypropylene vial. This wasn't the degraded, fragmented material she had harvested from the ancient evidence box in Oakhaven's basement. This was a fresh, pristine, high molecular weight genomic sample containing millions of intact base pairs that were ready to be read by the digital sensors of the sequencer. The laboratory went completely silent as the automated analysis phase began, the only sound being the rhythmic, mechanical click of the polymer pumps and the low, cooling hum of the supercomputers that processed the raw optical data. Lynn did not use the traditional, rapid STR testing that might take a few hours but leave room for statistical arguments by high-priced defense attorneys. She launched a comprehensive short tandem repeat and single nucleotide polymorphism co-analysis, a dual-track testing protocol that would generate a statistical probability of a mismatch so infinitesimally small that it would effectively challenge the total number of human beings who had ever existed on the planet. The machines worked through the afternoon, translating the chemical bonds of Thomas Sterling's bloodline into a massive 4-gigabyte digital file composed of the letters A, C, T, and G, the universal blueprint of human identity. At exactly 4:12 p.m., the terminal screen in the war room flashed a bright, solid green, indicating that the alignment algorithm had completed its comparison between the diner cigarette harvested 24 hours prior and the 40-year-old Winston filter recovered from the body of Becky Vance in 1985. Lynn stood perfectly still, her hands resting flat against the edge of the desk, her breath catching in her throat as the statistical metrics populated the display grid. The software didn't just show a high probability, it delivered an absolute, flawless, numerical identity match across all 24 international loci, followed by a matching profile of over 500,000 individual SNPs. The mathematical readout at the bottom of the page read, $text probability of random match equals 1 text in 7.3 times 1015 $a number that exceeded the total population of the Earth by a factor of nearly 1 million. The man who had stood at the altar of the First Baptist Church for 40 years, preaching about the absolute purity of the soul and the terrifying reality of divine judgment, was the exact same individual who had left his saliva on a piece of trash beside a dying 16-year-old girl. There was no longer a genealogical probability. There was no longer a family tree of 3 possible brothers. There was only one man standing in the center of the crosshairs. Lynn picked up the landline phone that connected directly to the Director of Public Safety's private office, her voice remarkably calm despite the absolute storm of adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Director, we have the verdict. It's him." The profile from the Roadhouse matches the 1985 evidence with total absolute certainty. "You can sign the paperwork." The bureaucratic machinery in Austin immediately shifted from a cautious data gather into a high-velocity, legal assault. Within 2 hours, a senior state prosecutor had drafted a 30-page affidavit for a capital murder arrest warrant, a document packed with dense forensic data, genomic charts, and the timeline of the surveillance operation. They didn't take the warrant to a local judge in Oakhaven, where a leak could occur within minutes through well-connected court clerks or church-going administrative assistants. They secured the signature of a state district judge in Austin, who signed the parchment beneath the dim light of his private study, his expression grim as he read the name of the spiritual leader whose face was plastered on billboards across the state highway system. The timing of the arrest was the subject of an intense, late-night debate within the Tactical Command Center. Some of the senior officers wanted to launch a midnight raid on Sterling's private estate, smashing through the heavy oak doors with a flash bang and a dynamic entry team to secure him while he slept. But investigator Marcus Vance fiercely opposed the plan, arguing that a midnight raid on a beloved community figure would look like a government hit job, allowing his thousands of followers to frame the arrest as a malicious persecution by secular forces. He lives his life in public, Vance argued, his finger tapping the surveillance map of the church parking lot. He thinks he's a god in that town. We take him down in the light of day, right on his own steps, where his staff and his security can see that his armor doesn't mean a damn thing to a state warrant. The decision was finalized for Tuesday morning, May 12th, at precisely 9 a.m., a time when the church administrative staff would be fully present, the local morning traffic would have cleared, and Sterling would be walking from his residence to his private executive suite for his weekly financial meeting. The state deployed 3 separate, unmarked tactical units, driving heavy black SUVs with tinted windows, their license plates registered to fictitious state utility corporations to avoid drawing the attention of the retired deputies who patrolled the church perimeter. The officers wore civilian clothes over their heavy ceramic body armor, their high-caliber weapons concealed beneath long canvas coats, their pockets stuffed with extra zip ties and recording devices to capture every word that came out of the pastor's mouth during the initial takedown. As the convoy left Austin on Monday evening, moving silently toward the dark pine forests of East Texas, Sarah Lynn remained alone in the laboratory, staring at the high-definition image of the 1985 Winston cigarette filter on her monitor. She looked at the tiny brown stains, the frayed paper edges, the microscopic preservation of a moment of absolute horror that had remained frozen in a cardboard box for 40 long years. She thought about Becky Vance walking home from that football game, her mind filled with the innocent details of high school life, completely unaware that the man who would spend the next 4 decades pretending to save her town was waiting for her in the shadows with a razor-sharp blade. The science had done its part. The digital noose was securely tied around the neck of the saint. All that was left was for the physical world to catch up to the mathematics of retribution, tearing down the temple of the wicked brick by individual brick. Soundproof environment of Interview Room 3 at the State Justice Center took exactly 2 hours of high-velocity driving. Inside the facility, the atmosphere was stripped of all administrative hierarchy and spiritual reverence. There were no cedar panels, no leather-bound volumes, and no stained glass windows to diffuse the stark, blue-white glare of the overhead fluorescent tubes. The room was a concrete block box containing a single steel table bolted to the floor, 3 heavy plastic chairs, and a massive, one-way mirror that dominated the western wall, behind which a team of senior prosecutors and behavioral analysts sat in absolute silence, their eyes fixed on the man who had dictated the moral code of an entire county for 40 years. Thomas Sterling sat in the center chair, his hands handcuffed behind his back, his tailored charcoal suit jacket removed to reveal the damp, sweat-stained fabric of his dress shirt underneath. The silver hair that had looked so majestic under the pulpit lights was now frayed and damp, clinging to his forehead in thin, erratic streaks that made him look less like a prophet and more like a high-stakes corporate fraudster who had finally run out of accounts to liquidate. For the first 90 minutes of his confinement, he had maintained a rigid, theatrical silence, his eyes fixed on the blank gray wall ahead of him, his lips moving in a rhythmic, silent cadence that looked like a prayer, but felt to the watching profilers like a continuous rehearsal of a defense narrative. Investigator Marcus Vance walked into the room at precisely 11:45 a.m., carrying a single, heavy blue cardboard accordion folder containing the physical and digital legacy of October 25, 1985. He didn't drop the file onto the table with a theatrical slam. He placed it down with a slow, deliberate neatness, pulling out his chair and sitting directly opposite the suspect with his hands flat against the steel surface. Marcus didn't activate a portable recording device, as the 3 high-definition studio microphones embedded in the ceiling were already streaming the audio directly to a secure state server in Austin. "Thomas," Marcus began, his voice dropping into a flat, conversational tone that deliberately stripped the suspect of his clerical title, an immediate psychological demotion designed to test his ego boundaries. "The local news is already running the footage of your transport. The governor's office has pulled your name from the state advisory council list, and your church deacons are currently in an emergency meeting with a team of defense attorneys trying to figure out how to protect their assets. The kingdom is gone. It's just you and me in this room." Sterling did not immediately shift his gaze from the wall, his jaw tightening until the muscles at the base of his ears pulsed beneath his skin. When he finally turned his head to look at Marcus, his blue eyes were completely clear, devoid of the soft, pastoral warmth he used to heal the broken, replaced instead by a cold, razor-sharp intensity that looked for a weakness in the detective's demeanor. "You speak of kingdoms, investigator, because your mind is consumed by earthly politics and petty ambitions," Sterling said, his magnificent baritone remarkably steady despite the hours of isolation, filling the small concrete room with its natural, vibrating resonance. "You think you have captured a criminal. You don't understand that you are merely participating in a grander, spiritual trial. The adversary has sought to pull down this ministry for 4 decades because we stood against the darkness. This warrant is nothing but a compilation of fabrications and statistical illusions designed to silence a voice of truth." Marcus didn't blink. He reached into the blue folder, pulling out a series of high-contrast, glossy forensic photographs from 1985 and laying them out across the steel table like a deck of tarot cards. The first image was a stark, close-up shot of Becky Vance's face as she lay in the frozen weeds of the Route 9 drainage ditch, her skin the color of old porcelain, her wide, vacant eyes staring up at the flashing red lights of the original police vehicles. The second was a macro photograph of the deep, clean, horizontal gash across her neck, displaying the surgical precision of the wound that had severed her carotid artery in a matter of seconds. "Let's talk about your spiritual trial, Thomas," Marcus said, his finger resting flat against the edge of the first photo. "This isn't an illusion. This is Becky Vance. She was 16 years old. She wasn't an adversary. She was a child who trusted that the streets of her own town were safe because men like you were preaching about the angels. You stood behind her on that dirt shortcut. You used your height to pin her arms, and you drew a 5-inch hunting knife across her throat from left to right. You didn't do it for money, and you didn't do it because she knew a secret. You did it because you wanted to see what it felt like to be the one who decides when a heart stops beating." Sterling's eyes dropped to the photographs for a fraction of a second, his pupils dilating as his mind processed the physical reality of the crime scene he hadn't seen since the night he created it. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift occurred in his posture. His shoulders dropped back slightly, his chest expanding as he took a deep, steadying breath, his face settling into a mask of serene, stoic detachment that profilers categorize as the classic shield of a malignant narcissist. "I have wept over those images more times than you have ever drawn breath, young man," Sterling murmured, his tone softening into the gentle, sorrowful cadence he usually reserved for funeral houses. "I sat with Arthur and Martha Vance in their kitchen while they screamed for their daughter. I carried her coffin to the grave when the rest of this town was too terrified to leave their houses. I know the horror of that night because I bore the weight of this community's grief on my back for 40 years. If you think the presence of my family's lineage in this county makes me a butcher, you are failing the basic tenets of logic." "We're past the lineage argument, Thomas," Marcus interrupted, his voice cutting through the pastoral performance with a cold, administrative finality. He pulled a fresh sheet of paper from the folder, the genomic analysis report generated 48 hours prior by Sarah Lynn in the Austin laboratory. "This isn't a family tree probability anymore. This is a direct match. We tracked you to the Rusty Nail last Friday. We watched you order a double shot of bourbon, and we watched you smoke a Winston cigarette. We harvested that cigarette but out of the ashtray the moment your car left the gravel. Marcus slid the genomic chart across the steel table, his pen pointing to the 24 international loci markers that were aligned in 2 perfectly identical columns. The DNA extracted from your fresh saliva in that tavern matches the DNA extracted from the dried saliva on the Winston cigarette left 3 feet from Becky Vance's body in October 1985, Marcus stated, the words falling into the small room like heavy pieces of iron. The probability that this profile belongs to any other man on this planet is 1 in 7.3 quadrillion.
That means it's you, Thomas.
There are no other brothers, no drifters from Houston, no phantoms from the highway. Your mouth touched the cigarette that sat in that clover while her blood was still sinking into the dirt. The silence that followed this statement was absolute, a suffocating, pressurized vacuum that lasted for nearly 2 minutes. The pastoral facade, the holy cadence, the serene confidence that had sustained the suspect through 40 years of public adoration didn't just crack. It dissolved entirely, evaporating beneath the heat of the mathematical certainty laid out on the paper before him. Sterling stared at the genomic columns, his mouth opening slightly as his breathing became rapid and shallow, his nostrils flaring as the survival instincts of an unmasked predator began to misfire inside his brain. Behind the one-way mirror, the behavioral analysts leaned forward, watching the physical dissolution of a saint. Sterling's head dropped slightly, his silver hair falling forward to cover his eyes as a low, trembling vibration began at the base of his neck and moved through his shoulders. For a moment, it looked as if he were about to weep, to break into a performance of profound, historic repentance that could be used by his legal team to angle for insanity defense or a life sentence without parole. But when he finally raised his face back up to look at Marcus, there were no tears in his blue eyes. Instead, his mouth was twisted into a slow, terrifying smile, a cynical, arrogant expression of pure, unadulterated vanity that had nothing to do with the church and everything to do with the dark, hidden thrill of a secret that had finally outgrown its hiding place. The voice that came out of his throat wasn't the beautiful, booming baritone of the pulpit. It was a dry, gravelly, monotone whisper that chilled the recording technicians in the sound booth to the bone. 7.3 quadrillion, Sterling muttered, his fingers twitching slightly within the steel loops of the handcuffs behind his back. You think you've caught me with a number, investigator. You think you've solved a puzzle. You don't realize that the number doesn't change what I built. It doesn't change the fact that for 40 years, every law, every election, and every soul in that county belonged to me. I didn't just escape the justice of man. I used your justice as the bricks for my temple. He leaned forward across the steel table, his face just inches from Marcus's, the scent of stale roadhouse tobacco still clinging to his breath. I didn't know her, Sterling whispered, his eyes widening with a cold, manic intensity that revealed the true architecture of his psychosis. She was just a shape in the mist behind the bus barn. I had been sitting in my car for 3 hours, listening to the radio, feeling this boiling, magnificent heat in my chest that I couldn't extinguish with prayer or fasting. I had spent my whole youth being the good boy, the holy student, the righteous son, while everyone around me was weak, dirty, and broken. I wanted to see if I could step out of the light, perform an act of absolute, sovereign destruction, and step back into the sanctuary without anyone ever seeing the blood on my fingers. He paused, a short, dry chuckle rattling in his throat as his eyes scanned the photographs of the drainage ditch with a terrifying, nostalgic fondness. And I did it, he continued, his whisper growing sharper, more intense. I cut her open, I watched her slide into the mud, and then I walked into her parents' kitchen the next morning and led them in prayer. And do you know what happened, investigator? The town didn't curse me. They elevated me. The more they grieved, the louder I preached, and the larger my church grew. I used her blood to build the platform for my ministry. Every sermon I ever delivered on the existence of the devil was a masterpiece of truth, because I knew exactly what the devil looked like. He was the one standing behind the pulpit, offering them salvation while his hands were still stained with their daughters' lives. Marcus Vance sat perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask of professional detachment, though his fingers were pressed so tightly against the steel table his knuckles had turned entirely white. He had secured the confession. The studio microphones had captured every syllable of the pastor's self-indictment, a pristine, airtight recording that would ensure his execution under the capital murder statutes of the state of Texas. There would be no high-priced legal loopholes, no complex appeals based on circumstantial evidence, and no political interventions from his old friends in Austin. The Saint of Oakhaven had spoken his own damnation into the record, providing the final, absolute confirmation that his entire life of faith had been nothing more than a lethal illusion curated by an apex predator. As Marcus stood up to leave the room, closing the blue folder with a sharp, definitive snap, Sterling remained leaning forward, his eyes still fixed on the pale face of Becky Vance in the photograph, his terrifying smile frozen in the glare of the fluorescent tubes. He had lost his freedom, he had lost his ministry, and he had lost his crown, but in his corrupted, narcissistic mind, he had won the ultimate victory over time itself. He had proven that a man could live as a monster in the heart of paradise for 40 years, using the very grief of his victims as the fuel for his ascension, leaving an entire community to sit forever amidst the smoking, ruined remains of a faith that had been weaponized against them from the very beginning. 9. The architectural exposure. The mechanical preservation of a lie for 40 years requires more than just an iron will. It requires a structural accomplice, a physical and administrative matrix that systematically swallows any anomaly before it can disturb the surface of the community. On Wednesday, May 13, 2026, 24 hours after the concrete-grounded takedown of Pastor Thomas Sterling, the state authorities realized that the investigation could not stop at the confession recorded in Interview Room 3. To ensure an airtight prosecution that could withstand the multi-layered legal assault of a capital murder trial, a team of 20 state forensic accountants, digital analysts, and structural engineers descended upon the First Baptist Church of Oakhaven. They arrived with federal search warrants that allowed them to dismantle the private executive suite of the ministry, targeting the very masonry that had served as the physical fortress for the killer's double life. The operation was conducted with a cold, industrialized detachment that stood in stark contrast to the emotional chaos vibrating through the surrounding county. State troopers established a perimeter with yellow crime scene tape, blocking off the grand cedar-paneled corridors of the administrative wing, while technicians in white Tyvek suits wheeled in heavy equipment cases containing document scanners, ground-penetrating radar units, and chemical detection arrays. The church staff, stripped of their authoritative routine, stood in small, weeping clusters in the gravel parking lot, watching the systematic desecration of what they had believed was a holy sanctuary. They were about to learn that the architecture of their faith had been meticulously engineered to function as a storage facility for an apex predator's trophies. Investigator Marcus Vance walked through the double doors of the pastor's private study at 8:15 a.m., accompanied by Sarah Lynn, who had left her Austin laboratory to supervise the recovery of any latent biological or physical material that might link Sterling to other unsolved disappearances along the interstate corridor. The room was immense, smelling of expensive beeswax polish, old calfskin bindings, and the faint, sweet aroma of the vanilla tobacco Sterling favored for his private pipe. A massive, floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelf dominated the back wall, packed with thousands of volumes of historical theology, state legal codes, and bound copies of the church's financial reports from 1988 to the present day. In the center of the room sat the heavy mahogany executive desk, an antique piece of furniture that looked less like a pastoral workstation and more like the bench of a high court judge. The behavioral profile suggested he didn't just leave the past behind when he built this place, Lynn said, her fingers gloved in sterile blue nitrile as she touched the edge of the heavy desk. A narcissist of his caliber requires a physical anchor to his victories. He needs to know that he is smarter than everyone walking through that door, that he is sitting right on top of the evidence while his deacons are writing him checks for his building fund. The initial electronic sweep of the desk utilized high-frequency electromagnetic sensors to detect hidden wiring or magnetic locking mechanisms within the wood panels. For 2 hours, the technicians mapped the internal structure of the mahogany desk, discovering 3 standard drawers on either side, all packed with routine administrative material: church budgets, land acquisition strategies for the private academy, and folders of letters from prominent politicians thanking Sterling for his spiritual guidance during state campaigns. Everything was pristine, orderly, and aggressively legal. But as the structural analyst ran a thermal imaging camera across the rear modesty panel of the desk, the thick sheet of wood that faced the visitors' chairs, the display screen revealed a sharp, rectangular heat anomaly deep within the central support column. The physical mechanics of the hidden compartment were a testament to Sterling's meticulous nature. It wasn't a crude, hollowed-out space behind a fake drawer. It was an integrated, mechanically decoupled vault built into the structural spine of the desk itself. To activate the release, a person had to simultaneously press two independent wooden knots on opposite sides of the interior knee well while applying a specific, downward pressure of precisely 15 pounds to the central leather writing inlay on the desktop. The technician applied the pressure, and with a low, hydraulic click that broke the silence of the room, a 6-inch section of the mahogany panel slid back into the frame, revealing a heavy steel lockbox bolted directly to the cast-iron frame of the desk's structural support. The lockbox was removed using hydraulic shears and placed onto a sterile drape in the center of the room. When the state locksmith finally picked the high-security cylinder, the contents within didn't just verify the confession Sterling had delivered in Austin. They expanded the historical ledger of his atrocities into a cross-state nightmare that left the investigators in absolute, breathless silence. The first object lifted from the black velvet interior was the small, tarnished silver cheerleader megaphone charm that had been snipped from Becky Vance's wrist in October 1985, its metal surface still holding microscopic traces of her dried blood within the fine engravings of her initials. But the charm wasn't alone in the dark. Tucked behind it lay an identical row of 7 other glass vials, each labeled with a small, typed paper strip indicating a date, a location, and a single first name. One vial contained a cheap turquoise ring from a truck stop outside Shreveport, Louisiana, dated June 1982. Another held a small gold crucifix necklace from a community college student who had vanished from a bus station in Tyler, Texas, in April 1984. A third contained a simple red plastic hair barrette from a 12-year-old girl who had disappeared from a county fair near Nacogdoches in August 1987. Sterling hadn't just struck once in Oak Haven. He had been a systematic, wide-ranging interstate predator who used his early career as a traveling youth evangelist to harvest victims across the entire Gulf Coast region, using his positions of moral authority to scout, trap, and destroy young lives before returning to his pulpit to preach about the rise of missing children in a broken world. He kept an archive, Marcus Vance whispered, his face turning an ashen, pale gray as he looked down at the row of glass vials, each representing a family that had spent decades looking at the highway, wondering if their daughters had run away to the big cities or been taken by a drifter. He didn't just build a church to hide from us. He built a museum for his kills. Every time he sat at this desk to write a sermon on the sanctity of the family, he was resting his wrists right above the jewelry he tore off the corpses of these kids. Sarah Lynn immediately moved the box under a portable UV light source. Her eyes narrowed as the high-intensity blue light illuminated the interior documents. Beneath the vial sat a series of small, black-bound notebooks, private spiritual journals that spanned 40 years of daily writing. These weren't filled with prayers for his congregation or administrative notes for his ministries. They were written in a dense, highly structured, microscopic shorthand that detailed the anatomical mechanics of every attack, the behavioral reactions of his victims as they realized they were trapped by a holy man, and the intense, chaotic rushes of psychological power he experienced as he stepped back into his church duties with their blood still drying on his shoes. The journals revealed a psychological profile of a killer who used the church not as a place of repentance, but as a secondary laboratory for his sadism. In an entry dated October 27, 1985, 2 days after Becky Vance was murdered, Sterling had written, "The grief in the sanctuary this morning was a sweet perfume. Arthur wept during the opening invocation, his hands shaking so violently he dropped his hymnal. I took the pulpit and spoke from 1 Thessalonians about the thief in the night. The absolute control is not found in the strike itself. It is found in the aftermath, in the ability to stand before the Father, to touch his shoulder, to absorb his tears, knowing that I am the one who holds the key to his hell. They look at me and see God. I look at them and see Clay. The revelation of this secondary archive completely transformed the legal landscape of the case, shifting it from a single local cold case resolution into a massive, multi-jurisdictional task force operation that would dominate federal crime databases for years to come. The state prosecutors realized that Sterling's defense team, which had already been assembled by a consortium of high-priced corporate defense attorneys from Houston, would have no room to argue that the 1985 DNA match was a fluke or a case of cross-contamination. The physical possession of the victim's jewelry, stored inside a highly secure, mechanical hidden vault that could only be accessed through a complex physical combination known exclusively to the suspect, was the ultimate legal hammer. It was a chain of physical custody that led straight from the wet mud of the Route 9 drainage ditch into the center of the pastor's executive office. As the technicians began the slow, meticulous process of cataloging every individual item within the lockbox, sealing the glass vials into separate evidence bags for transport back to the state laboratory in Austin, Marcus Vance walked out onto the private balcony of the office. He looked across the manicured lawns of the church campus, past the parking lots that had been paved over the old dirt paths, toward the distant tree line where Route 9 cut through the pines. The sun was high in the sky now, its bright, relentless light exposing every crack in the white brick facade of the grand sanctuary building. The temple was no longer a place of worship. It was a crime scene, a monument to a lifetime of calculated slaughter, its bells permanently silenced as the physical evidence of its architect's true nature was carried out into the light of day.